So good evening, everyone. Welcome to New York Buddha Dharma. Let's bow in. I thought to break up the reading for tonight into 2 evenings. Seems like too much to cover in one. So tonight we'll just do the Four Noble Truths. Just. The four Aryan Satya. Arya means noble, Aryan, and Satya means truths. This was the first teaching by the Buddha Sakyamuni after his enlightenment. After his enlightenment, he felt that what he had seen and discovered was not communicable. And so he wandered India for a while, for some weeks, not saying anything, until he chanced upon 4 fellow renunciates, people with whom he had practiced renunciation and physical austerities and meditation practices. And when they saw him, they thought that he had fallen off the path because he was no longer physically emaciated as he had been. He had taken sustenance. In fact, shortly before his enlightenment, he had been starving himself, and he decided that this wasn't doing anything helpful. And a young girl came to him and offered him milk and honey, and he took it. So when they saw him, looking physically well, and they thought that he had abandoned the path. But then they noticed that there was something unusual about him, something different than what they expected. And so they asked him for teachings to explain himself. All this took place outside the modern, what is now the modern city of Varanasi. Used to be called, oh my gosh, what was it under the British? Doesn't matter. And outside that city is an area, a little town called Sarnath. And in Sarnath, if you go there today, of course, it's been turned into a shrine. And the Buddha gave teachings in a forest, in a grove outside of Sarnath. It's called, it's still called Sarnath. I'm thinking of something else. And there has also been a stupa erected. A stupa is a monument to the Buddha. Originally, the stupas first appeared after his death, and they were big domes, and they were meant to house relics of his body, and they were objects of worship. And they spread all over India, and there were many that were built, of course, with no relics at all, but symbolic of the devotion to him. And then they spread through Southeast Asia, and you're familiar with them in the form of what are called pagodas in Thailand and Cambodia, and also in Japan. A pagoda is an oriental version of a stupa. If you were to see the stupa at Sarnath, it must be about, I would guess, somewhere between 100 and 200 feet high. It's hard to imagine. And it's a big dome, white. And as an act of piety, pilgrims circumambulate it, going clockwise, and perhaps chanting as they go, or spinning a prayer wheel, or whatever they do. In any event, at Sarnath, the Buddha gave these 4 individuals teachings. And he found that he could teach what he had understood. The teaching that he gave is the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And this is called the first turning of the Wheel of Dharma by the Buddha. Sometimes just abbreviated to the first turning. There were 2 more turnings of significance. The second turning took place considerably later, after he had accumulated a number of monks and nuns, a sangha of arhats. Arhats are Hinayana practitioners who have achieved a certain degree of realization on the path, and bodhisattvas, and they're practitioners who've gone even further. And at a place outside of, the Buddha achieved enlightenment at what is now out near the city of, modern city of Gaya. And you can go and there's a stupa that's built there to honor his enlightenment, where he sat under the Bodhi tree and achieved enlightenment through the night. And that's called Bodh Gaya. Bodh as in Bodhi, meaning awakened. To the north of Bodh Gaya, within an easy drive, you're still in the province of Bihar in northern India. And you can come to where the Buddha gave his second turning. It's called the Vulture Peak Mountain in the area of the town of Rajagriha. Rajagriha means the domain of the king. Raja is a king or a Raja. And in this area, there is what they call the Vulture Peak Mountain. I went there in 2007, and there's a road going up and it spirals up. And it's kind of like a big dome, a big mound. It's not really a mountain the way you would think of a Rocky Mountain or something like that. But it's high and it rises out of the plains. And at the very top, there is a stone platform. And pilgrims come there to, pay their respects or whatever they do. And it has a little, very low stone wall around this sort of slate platform, maybe about 30 feet square. And you can sit there. And so I sat there and chanted the Heart Sutra. I thought it was appropriate. The Heart Sutra starts out, "Thus have I heard, once the Blessed One in Rajagriha at Vulture Peak Mountain, together with a great gathering of the Sangha of monks and the Sangha of bodhisattvas." And there it is. You can sit there and chant that whole thing. And this is the second turning. And in the second turning, the Buddha taught the teaching of emptiness, shunyata, which means that nothing has any real existence. Nothing has its own being. And what that really means is, the way it's defined technically, is that everything that arises, this mallet, this me, these words, this voice, anything, this table, one. There are three qualities that are three aspects. The first is, we think these things endure through time. That's just an idea. That this thing was here 2 seconds ago is just a thought in the mind. And in terms of what we experience in the present moment, you turn your head and everything changes in the instant. So the first thing is that nothing endures through time. This is the first quality of existence that's denied. The second quality is that things are unitary. So I am one, you are one, this mallet is one, these words are one. And that is denied. Nothing is one. Everything is made up of parts, and the parts are ultimately and infinitely divisible. The third quality that's denied is that things are independent, have an independent existence. And what Buddhism asserts is that everything that arises in a matrix of dependency, dependent on everything else that's arising in the moment with it. And that nothing has any independent existence. And what they're really saying is that the things that we think are barriers, like, this glass and whatever it might be, actually have no solidity to them at all. They are just appearances, like images in a mirror, like images on water, reflections on water. They come and they go, like the images on this computer screen that we're all looking at. It just comes and goes moment to moment. And in the moment it appears, and in the moment it disappears, changes continually. And that's the teaching he gave It's the teaching, the ultimate teaching of egolessness, that neither I nor other exist, which creates tremendous room, tremendous space for all of us to appreciate this beautiful world as it arises in the present moment with compassion, with heart, the beauty of it, the heat of it. The third turning took place towards the end of his life in southern India. A king there named Indrabhuti invited the Buddha to come and give teachings. But when he came, the king pointed out to the Buddha that he was not going to become a monk, nor were any of his courtiers going to become monks or nuns. And could the Buddha give a teaching that would help lay people to achieve enlightenment, to awaken, that was appropriate for people who weren't going to become monastics? And there the Buddha gave the teaching of Tantra. The Tantra was aimed at ordinary lay people. And the first tantric teaching that he gave was called the Kala Chakra Tantra. A Tantra is both a body of teachings, but it's also a particular name for a particular kind of text. This text is very, very pithy, very succinct, very hard to understand. Most Tantras, they need a real profound individual to explain them. And the Kala Chakra is probably one of the oldest and most beautiful of the Tantras. It's called, the Kala Chakra means Wheel of Time Tantra. And that's what he gave to Indrabhuti and his court in southern India. So tonight we're going to talk about and look at the first turning. These turnings are famous, they're huge in Buddhism. And the first turning is about the Four Noble Truths. These are the first words out of the Buddha's mouth after he achieved enlightenment, supposedly. These four truths are a unit. So we'll just start with the first and work through them. The first truth is the truth of suffering. The word for suffering is dukkha. If my papers rattle, let me know. Somebody raise a hand, okay. I'm going to try not to do that, make noise. And suffering lies in the belief in a self and in the thoughts which constellate around that belief in self. As long as one believes in I, one is constantly going to be having thoughts and emotions. And these thoughts and emotions are all about the relationship of I. And as soon as you've got an I, there's an other. And so there's this relationship between I and other. And these relationships are fraught. They're difficult. They're full of tension. And that tension is expressed in the thoughts that we think. We think about thoughts of hatred, of love, of passion, of lust, of envy, of pride. All of these thoughts have to do with the relationship between me and others. And they're full of suffering. Because fundamentally, we want things to be different in thought than they are. That is the very nature of thought, is the desire that things should be different. Most often, it has to do with an improvement in me and my circumstances. That's what thought is always about. It's always about getting free from what we don't want and finding what we do. And so it's full of anxiety, hope and fear, tension. When you begin to practice meditation, and you begin to practice if you've studied, for instance, in a yoga studio, or perhaps done transcendental meditation, or even done Buddhist meditation where you're focusing one pointedly on an object. That object could be the breath, and you're watching it go in and out, maybe even counting the breaths. It could be a mantra that you're saying. It could be an image of a Buddha or anything you want. It could be a penny sitting in front of you. And that practice of shamatha, which is not what I was guiding you in tonight. I was guiding you in the next practice, the more advanced practice of Vipassana. But that practice of shamatha, that one-pointed concentration on an object, has three main benefits. The first is that the practitioner discovers, when they begin this practice, how much they are lost in thought. Most people walk down the street and don't even realize the extent to which they're thinking. Even now we do that, all of us, even though we're meditators. And then suddenly we wake up and we realize, oh, I'm lost in thought again. But most people who have never meditated, their entire loyalty is to thought. And so the first benefit of practicing shamatha is that you begin to see the extent to which you are lost in thinking. The second benefit is that you begin to develop the ability to focus your mind in the present moment, to bring it back from dreams and into the present moment. If you're working with the breath only happens in the present. And every time you're aware of the breath as it's happening, you're back in the present, at least for an instant, if not more. And the third benefit of shamatha, and this is the one that pertains to this tonight's discussion, is that you get a rest from the suffering of thought. By coming back from thinking into awareness of the present moment, you actually get a good rest. You can actually feel rested by the end of your meditation practice. And I know many people who say that they do with any meditation practice. I listened to a Lama whom you might come across if some of you haven't already. His name is Chungling Rinpoche. And he came and spoke at the Westchester Buddhist Center some months ago. And during the Q&A, someone asked him about shamatha meditation. And he said, it's like taking a really good nap. That was his description of this kind of meditation. See, Buddhist meditation goes way beyond this. Buddhist meditation is not just about concentration on an object. That's sort of a way of going to sleep or going ultimately into trance. Buddhist meditation is really about waking up and awareness. So the basic mechanism of suffering is thought that revolves around belief in an I that we want to protect. Thoughts of the three times, past, present, and future. And they're lit by struggle, fear of the death of the self, me, or the diminution of it, and the desire to maintain yourself and make yourself bigger, stronger. Constantly repeated feeling that something is lacking and incomplete in our lives is the essence of suffering. So we're always trying to fill the gap, make things right, secure good for me. And this is suffering. It's very irritating, it's very painful. He says, Trungpa Rinpoche, eventually one begins to become irritated by just being me. There is a continual busyness, a continual searching and grasping in our minds. We're just busy, busy, busy. There are three kinds of suffering that you might come across. They're not mentioned in this reading. The first is the basic suffering, which is really what I've been discussing tonight. And it's really a feeling of heaviness about oneself. That there's this sort of quality to me, to carrying me around. I'm just such a burden. I'm a sack of woe. I'm just constantly unhappy. That's the first suffering. It's the basic suffering. The second suffering has to do with change. You got something you wanted, and then it disintegrated. That's suffering. You know, you got something you didn't want, and it got worse. That's suffering. So there's the suffering of change. Then the last one is called the suffering of suffering, And what that means is you got a cold, and then it turned into pneumonia, and then you fell and you broke your leg, and then your leg got infected. It's like that. It just builds, in one way or another. I'm just making that one up. And that's called the suffering of suffering. So this is the truth of suffering. The second truth is the truth of the origin of suffering, the second noble truth. Some people, remember Jay writes, some people seek to conquer and destroy ego, the sense of I. This is merely another expression of ego. Only ego wants to destroy ego. He used to say, ego wants to be there for its own funeral. Saying, oh, it's so sad that ego died. That's ego. And basically, the fundamental expression of ego is self-improvement. And I always remember back in the day, we read the Don Juan books by Carlos Castaneda about the Yaqui Mexican Indian sorcerer, Don Juan. He was a brujo. And Castaneda was this Los Angeles intellectual, taught at UCLA. And he went down to Mexico and met Don Juan. And Don Juan began to teach him the Yaqui path of knowledge. And in one of the books, I think it was the second one, Castaneda describes being with Don Juan and Don Juan's good buddy, Don Carlos, I think his name was, Don Gennaro. His name was Don Gennaro. And they're both brujos, they're magicians, and sorcerers. And they know the way of knowledge, the way of wisdom. And Carlos Castaneda overhears the two of them talking about him. And they're snickering and they're laughing about what an intellectual he is and how he asks so many questions. And after a while, he interrupts them. And he asks Don Juan, should I stop asking questions? Don Juan says, oh no, don't do that. If you do that, he said, then you'd be trying to improve yourself. It's the worst vice people have. It's perfect, it's Buddhism. That this is the cause of suffering, it's the essence of suffering, this constant attempt to improve ourselves. Whoops, I guess we've got a delivery here somewhere. Val, have we got a delivery at the front door, I think? Maybe it's someone else. Sorry, time of COVID. I think it was someone else. So there's a more complex version of the origin of suffering. Here, just this is a really interesting one. He says, insights come only when there are gaps in the struggle to improve. Wrong door. When we stop trying to rid ourselves of thought, when we cease siding with the good against the bad thoughts, only when we allow ourselves simply to see the nature of thought is there a gap in ego. That is so powerful that when you sit and the thought comes up, whatever that thought may be, you don't try to get rid of it, you see it without any agenda, just pure awareness. And in that seeing, without agenda, without even trying to be aware, then there is a gap, and a real awareness takes place, a gap in ego. The real way that ego arises is that there's a teaching called the 5 Skandhas. These are the 5 stages of the development of ego. And the first one is this, that in reality, there's this open space that we inhabit with colors and lights and sounds and smells and tastes and mental events all flashing in and out of being, which is what they're doing right now. This word just flashed in and out. This gesture just appeared and disappeared. Now that I mention it, you can feel your bottom on the cushion, on whatever you're sitting on. And that just flashed in. And now your attention will go to something else and it's gone. And in the middle of this space, full of flashing six knowables, suddenly something concretizes. Something suddenly becomes solid. Something becomes a figure against which everything else is just ground. It's like the breath goes out into space, and if you forget about the space, you've forgotten about the ground, and you're just seeing the figure, and you've given it a kind of reality. This is what happens. This is the birth of ego, where something emerges against the ground, and that thing becomes more important than everything else, fades into relative unimportance. And if that's there, that thing that's just momentarily arisen, then there is an observer implied here, a seer. Now, you can never find that seer. If you go to look for it, it becomes another scene, another object, and it recedes infinitely back, the seer, because it's only an implication. If that's there, therefore the implication is this is here, the seer is here. And that seer is the seed, the beginning of I. And there's this relationship between that and this. And that relationship is very full of fear because, in fact, it's dying as it happens. It's a movement from there to here. It's a concretization of that, which only lasts for an instant. And then it's an implication. If that's there, I'm here. But as soon as you stop saying it, it disappears. So ego wants to keep it going. And it reaches out to make a relationship with that other. And there are only three possible relationships that I and other can have. They can either get further away from each other, they can come closer together to each other, or they can remain at the same distance. These are called the three poisons. They are passion, you see something and you think it's going to augment your existence, you pull it towards you. Aggression, you see something that's inimical, that's threatening, you push it away. And indifference, you see something that has no implication, for or against you, and you don't care, you just stay the same distance. And from this, we won't go into this tonight, on another time, the whole structure of ego builds until you wind up with this complicated mess of thought and emotion going on all the time in the mind. Thoughts about I and other, full of the three poisons and their elaborations into lust, pride, envy, jealousy, hatred, you name it. So this is the second noble truth, the truth of the origin of suffering. It happens magically, that in the middle of space, suddenly something separates a figure from the ground. And when that happens, it implies the existence of a seer here. And we're often running, building ego again and again. Whenever there's a gap, whenever we come back to awareness, we're coming back to that open space without a figure and a ground, without I and other. The third noble truth is the truth of the cessation of suffering, the truth of the goal of the path, which is non-striving. That's when ego gives up the attempt to improve itself. That's why Don Juan told Castaneda, it's the worst vice people have, self-improvement. It's just terrific. Fierce. His style was that of, in India, there were enlightened beings who got enlightened. And initially they were called siddhas. A siddha is one who holds siddhi. It's in one of the chants that we did this morning. The Padmasambhava chant, that he was a holder of great siddhis. Siddhis are powers. And there are two kinds of siddhis. the ordinary and the mundane and the sublime, or the profound. The mundane siddhis are supposedly things like being able to read minds, know a million languages, fly through space, put your hand through solid rock. These are the ordinary siddhis that come along supposedly with enlightenment. The supreme siddhi is enlightenment. And that's the one that's worth having. So, why am I doing this? The truth of the goal. That's Don Juan character. These siddhas were very like Don Juan. He's very much like these siddhas in India. You can read their stories. I think it was Keith Dowman who translated the stories of the 84 siddhas. They're famous, and they're all crazy and wild and fierce, like Don Juan was. Very unique, each one. I always loved the one, perhaps, if you've heard this, forgive me, the one about the story of the 84 siddhas was one who was so obese, this fellow. He was an ordinary human being, and he was so obese that he couldn't stand. And he just lay, and he was fed until his family got sick of him. And they had him carted out into a charnel ground and dumped there to die. A charnel ground is a place where people who were too poor to afford to have funerals and have their bodies cremated, their family would just take the body out and dump it in the charnel ground for the animals to eat. So this fellow was dumped out in the charnel ground. Now yogis would come to the charnel ground because the reminder of death, the corpses rotting and the bones and the jackals and the hyenas would give them inspiration to really, really practice hard. And there was this yogi out there in the charnel ground who saw this fat guy lying there and took pity on him. And he gave him teachings. And this guy got enlightened, lying on his back in the charnel ground. And he never left. And students came and received teachings from him for all his life. He was one of the 84 siddhas. I just love that. And they're all like that. They're all just one unique story after the next. So the truth of the goal is the truth of non-striving. We need only drop the effort to secure and solidify ourselves, and the awakened state is present. It's that constant effort for me, that keeps it hidden. And he says, but we soon realize that just letting go is the only possible for short periods. We need some sort of discipline to bring us to letting be, walking the spiritual path. Ego must wear itself out like an old shoe, journeying from suffering to liberation. That discipline brings us to the fourth noble truth, which is the truth of the path. And the only way, what that discipline is meditation. Coming back into the present moment, letting go of the past and the future with their constant striving for self-improvement. And coming back into the present. And we use a technique, whatever the technique is. It might be that we just rest in space. That's a very subtle technique. It might be that we use the breath, which is a little more heavy-handed. But this technique is meant to bring us back into the present moment to create a gap in our struggle, our striving for self-improvement. He says about meditation, it's not a trance-like state, not concentration, not mental gymnastics. It's about awareness of this, of the space that we're in. And if we're working with the breath, we follow the breath out, it dissolves into the space, and I dissolve with it. And then there's just this awareness of this present moment with whatever happens to be arising. We might only experience it for an instant before ego reasserts itself. And that's fine. You just do it again and again. It's like wearing out a pair of shoes. It's like water dripping on a rock, eventually wearing it out, repeated by repeated dripping. says, I'll just read you what he says. The practice of samadhi, samadhi means real meditation here. Doesn't mean trance. Does not involve concentration, which is ego reinforcing, centralized in the heart. There's a feeling when you're trying to do something really hard, like you're really inside, there's this center in you. And you're gazing fixedly on an object when you're trying to concentrate. It's a form of introversion. It's dangerous. It's introverted, too solemn, rigid, no humor, too dogmatic, imposing discipline on oneself. It's number 1, dogmatic, number 2, authoritarian, number 3, and worst of all, goal-oriented, future-oriented, and number 4, it misses the precision and openness and intelligence of the present moment. Ambition creates a blindfold. You are living too much in the future, insensitive to the present. So real meditation is stepping out of the ambition of ego and just relaxing into the awareness that we already have. That's there. It requires no ambition because we already have it. Isn't that ironic? So he makes some recommendations. He says, not to focus too much on the future attainment of the awakened state of mind. Meditation is based on the present moment, here and now, and means working with this situation. So it is a very effective way to live. If you are completely aware of your present state of mind and the situation around you, you cannot miss a thing. You're here for it all. And the various techniques, like one of ours of working with the breath, are just ways of stepping out of ego. He says a technique is like a toy given to a child. When the child grows up, the toy is discarded. And when we really awaken, you don't need the technique of meditation, self-conscious technique anymore. Your mind is the real meaning of meditation. Awake, aware, in the present moment. He says, this is all just good advice. You can read it in this chapter. You do not have to push yourself into the practice of meditation, but just let be. It's already there. If you practice this way, the feeling of space and ventilation automatically comes. The expression of Buddha nature or basic intelligence that is working its way through confusion. And then here's a really profound thing. He says, one begins to realize that everything we do in everyday life is beautiful and meaningful in this open awareness without ambition. You become aware that each precise movement has dignity, like pouring a cup of tea. Every act of our lives can contain simplicity and precision and can have tremendous beauty and dignity. And then likewise, the process of communication, where every pause is a punctuation. It is beautiful that you are not rushing. Space is as important in communicating to another person as talking. Seeing the nowness quality in action, openness and peace. So I'll stop there. And we could have a discussion if you like. Unmute yourselves if you would like to say something. Questions, comments, complaints.
I have a question.
Karen.
It sounds like the 3 turnings correspond to the Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. But the way you described the 3rd turning, where the Buddha is giving teachings to a king or a leader who is not going to be a monk. That reminds me of the legends told to us in Shambhala that led to the Buddha communicating Shambhala teachings.
Same thing. It's another version of it.
Are you saying that the Kala Chakra teachings are the Shambhala teachings?
They're very, very, very closely connected. The Kala Chakra in particular is very closely connected to the Shambhala teachings. Yes. And I can't really, I'm not enough of a scholar to tell you just how, but I know that they're very intertwined. They both, you see, there were two influences in Tibet, the Indian Buddhist influence and the Chinese coming from the East. And the Kala Chakra is full chock-a-block, and so is the Shambhala teachings with the Chinese influence. If you ever see a depiction of the Kala Chakra Tantra, the symbol of the Kala Chakra, the Wheel of Time, it's full of the Chinese hexagrams, that were used in the I Ching, to tell the future. And the Chinese had a big influence in Tibet. And so, yes, they're intertwined very much. And that story of Indrabhuti is also the story of the Buddha going to Shambhala and giving teachings there. And the teachings he gave there were the Kala Chakra. And everybody got enlightened. There's a wonderful video that I'll recommend to you. It's on YouTube. Have I told you about Ian Baker and his thing? I did. I told you about that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Ian Baker, The Heart of the World. One of the interesting things that he talks about is that there are 3 levels to these secret worlds. The highest level are the heavens, the Trishita heaven, the Akanishta heaven, the Sukhavati, the realm of bliss. And these are where Buddhas dwell. And these really represent very semi-enlightened and enlightened states of mind. And when you die, you might aspire to be reborn in one of these heavens because it's an excellent place from which to achieve enlightenment. Below them, and not the lowest yet, is Shambhala. Shambhala is not quite of this earth. It's a very ancient myth. And it's somewhere above the earth, in the ozone, kind of in a space. And it's the journey to it is a spiritual one. And then below that, on the earth, are the secret lands which Ian Baker set out to find, called the Bayul. And the journey to those lands is both a spiritual and a physical one, because they're actually located in a hidden place on the earth. And that video where he describes them, man, he shows you places and people that are so different from what you and I have ever seen, imagined. It's really powerful. So, but yeah, thank you, Karen, that's true. The Buddha gave the Vajrayana teachings also in Shambhala. It's a different version of his transmission of them.
So that's like a 4th turning.
No, it's all the 3rd turning. It's just a different version of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
There were only 3 turnings, as far as I know. I could be wrong.
John?
Yes.
Yeah. So before ego takes the shape or the self takes the shape, what was it before? Just mind or consciousness? It was just mind in the ground, or consciousness in the ground? And how does this consciousness make the jump to think that it has a self? Is it because maybe it thinks of a continuum, and then that is what they think as a self? Isn't that the mistake?
It's called error, actually, trulpa, the error. The idea of a before and after. You have to understand, time itself is an idea of ego. It has no real existence. It's just a dream. The idea of time, the past and the future, show me where they are. You know, they're just concepts.
But when does it happen? When does it takes that jump?
Now. That's all I could figure. And,
Okay.
and the way when Trungpa Rinpoche talked about it, he said that there is this magical separation out of something from the ground. You know, the ground is a huge, huge word in the tantric teachings. The word for it is alaya. So it's called the kunji, the ground of all. Sometimes it's called in Sanskrit the Dharma Dhatu, which means, Dhatu means space, and Dharma means events like sounds and sights and smells, and they all are arising and passing away in space. And Dharma Dhatu is one word for ultimate reality. In Tibetan, it's Chö Ying. Same meaning. Chö is the dharmas and Ying is the space. And what he said is that somehow magically in this thing before time, out of time, that suddenly something separates from the ground. And you know how it is. I always tell this story that when I was in my 20s, I was living in Greenwich Village. And one day I was walking around and there was a poster on the wall. And I look at it and it's this mass of swirls and lines and colors, and I can't figure out what it is, you know? And I'm staring at it, and suddenly it separates out, figure and ground. And I can read Grateful Dead, Fillmore East, date, time, the cost of a ticket, you know? But until the figure separated from the ground, I couldn't read it. And after that, I couldn't go back to not reading it. You know, I couldn't go back to where it was confusing anymore. Well, what happens, they say, about ego is the figure separates from the ground. And when you do that, you only see the figure. You ignore the ground. The ground becomes unimportant, becomes secondary. So for instance, years ago, Trungpa Rinpoche was giving a seminar, a class at the University of Colorado. The head of the religious studies department asked him to teach a class. And this is when he had just arrived in Boulder. He was about 30 years old. So he taught a class to undergraduates, sleepy bunch of people, mainly there for skiing. And one day his subject was the three bodies of the Buddha. This is a very profound subject. He went to the blackboard, picked up a piece of chalk, and drew a stick figure of a bird flying, wings outspread, beak like this, you know, feet. Turned to the class and said, "What is this a picture of?" Finally, some kid said, "It's a picture of a bird." He said, "It's a picture of the sky." You see that when we see that bird, we're ignoring the ground. We see only the figure. And when you see the ground, then you've got the picture of a sky with birds in it. And this is what ego does. Ego focuses on the figure and ignores the ground. And that figure there, that thing that's so important, that's emerged as an existent, implies me here. It says, if that's there, therefore I'm here, seeing it. You can never find I. If you go to look for I, I's looking for eyes, looking for I, looking for I, looking for I. It's an infinite regress. So what ego is, and that whole relationship between I and others, since it's imaginary, is fraught with fear of its own death, which is about to happen every second. It's about to just dissolve because it's a statement that there, therefore I'm here. It's over. Unless you keep the game going like a ping pong game. And you say, well, if I'm here and that's there, then what is that thing out there? How does it feel? Does it feel good, bad, indifferent? And I'm going to reach out and feel it. And then the message comes back again, you see, and we keep the game going between I and other until we get tired, and then there are gaps. You can read this actually, the same explanation and more in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, the chapter on the birth of ego. He goes through all 5 skandhas. And there are other places as well. And I should tell you that the version that he's giving us is much more advanced than the usual version. And I won't go into what the usual version is, but it's much more simplistic and less interesting. This is a dynamic version of how it actually happens. It's interesting, don't you think? He's telling us that our meditation technique is just a toy, like, and that we're children. And then as we grow up, you know what children do with toys, right? And that's what we'll do with the meditation technique when we don't need it anymore. It's like a crutch. And when your leg heals, you don't keep using the crutch. You give it away. Put it in the closet. I'll bet there are people here in this Zoom room who've got a crutch in their closet somewhere that they haven't gotten rid of quite yet. Maybe it'll come in handy someday, I think, one thinks. Who else? Tim.
So I confess, John, I had a little bit of extra time this evening, and so I cheated ahead and read next week's reading as well. And in next week's reading, it makes it sound like the 4th Noble Truth is the Eightfold Path. But if the 4th Noble Truth is just meditation, that sounds like the One-fold Path.
Yeah. Well, I guess what you say is that meditation is the heart of the Eightfold Path. It's the one thing you certainly can't do without. Yeah. He emphasized, in this reading on the 4 Noble Truths, he emphasized meditation. Because meditation really means the giving up of ego by coming back to awareness in the present moment. Again and again. By coming alive. Ego's dead. Ego's dead. We're being enjoined to come alive. The beauty of this present moment. Have you ever seen videos of him?
Yes.
You know, the way he held a glass of scotch as he gave his talk, the way he held his cigarette, there was such grace and a quality of awareness in it, you know, his gestures. As though everything could be a work of art. An act of appreciation. Yeah, I guess it's a contradiction, Eightfold Path. But meditation certainly is the most important part of it all. It's the overcoming of ego. Meditation in the broadest sense of that word, meaning awareness in the present moment. As we progress on the path, your meditation becomes more and more formless, more and more just resting in awareness.
You skipped a lot of things then. You have us resting in awareness already.
Right.
That is the Vajrayana.
That is the Vajrayana.
Yeah, no, that's what they are telling you.
Yeah, it's true. Vipassana.
Yeah.
Vipassana goes all the way through to the end of the path.
Uh-huh.
It changes names, you know, but the practice stays the same. And I think it changes names because as we become more and more into the present, the world changes. The way we see the world and understand what the world is and who we are. And that's really the different stages. So you get Vipassana morphing into shunyata meditation, morphing into Mahamudra and into Dzogchen.
Nature of mind.
Yeah. But that practice of Vipassana that we're doing here, of just resting in the space, that's the best practice. But it deepens. Gosh, everybody, I feel like I've created a bunch of silence. Trip, you have anything?
I don't know, no, I'm just kind of absorbing. I think where my head goes is when you're living at a frenetic pace, knowing that the more you sit, the more I meditate, in some sense makes it easier to be in such a frenetic time. And I think it just comes down to the discipline of just taking the time to sit and doing my practice. And it just always feels like there's never enough time. If I'm listening and I hear everything clearly, you can't go wrong if you put your butt in the cushion and really work on your practice and coming back to the present. And making the time for it and just doing it seems to be the challenge. The simple discipline of just sitting and making time.
I remember hearing Songsar Khyentse they gave a talk in which he identified a major impediment to the path: busyness. Busyness. So the biggest obstacle to overcome. In the Tantric teachings, which we'll get to at some point here, the structure of the Mandala, they're what are called the 5 Buddha families. These are 5 styles in which phenomena appear. And one of them, they're 5 because they're depicted in the Mandala as the 5 directions: north, south, east, west, and center. Each one of these directions has a wisdom. It has a neurosis, fundamental neurosis. It has a style of manifesting. So for instance, in the north, the family is called karma. It's the karma Buddha family.
Busy.
Karma means action, literally means action. And the wisdom that's connected with karma is all accomplishing. It accomplishes what needs to be accomplished. The klesha, meaning the defilement that's connected with it, is jealousy. And then there's a lot more to it. I mean, the color is green, the symbol is a sword, the season is the fall, the autumn, when everything is, the season is the summer, when everything is cooking. If you lifted a clod of grass, you'd see all these bugs and worms and everything underneath busily living their lives. That's karma. It's full of action, right, and activity. And it goes on and on like this. Everything in the phenomenal world is classified in one of these 5 ways. But the reason I'm mentioning it is that each one of us has families that carry our own particular style of how we manifest in the world, our unique style, and it conforms to these families, different mixtures of the families. Most people have 2 families. Sometimes you've got 3, 3 is a lot. And And then when you get enlightened, they really come out. They're muted when you're unenlightened because you're so lost in thought. But one of the ways that the families manifest too is as your neurosis. And this is called your exit. Your exit means the way in which you leave the present moment and go off into thought. And so, for instance, in the karma family, the way you leave the present moment when you get neurotic is by getting very busy. You give yourself lots of work. You make lists of the things you want to do, and you create all this tension, and you cross off things off the list, and you feel better as you do, and you keep adding to the lists, right?
Yes.
This is the karma neurosis.
Obsession.
It's the karma exit.
Yeah.
Now, there are other exits. So, for instance, the Ratna family, the virtue of the Ratna family is tremendous generosity. And the season is the autumn, and the direction is the south. And the symbol is a jewel. And it's fecund, it's full of, it's so rich, the Ratna family. And it's like in the autumn, the fruit is so ripe, it's just about to fall off the trees. The neurosis and the way in which a Ratna person avoids being in the present moment, their exit, is to consume, shopping, eating, consumption of one thing after another. And Ratna people, if they're neurotic, tend to get fat. And even if they're not neurotic, they often get heavy, So you get rid of your anxiety, you see. If you're in the karma family, it's speed. The Ratna family, it's consumption. Padma family, the way you avoid being in the present is by seduction. You're constantly seducing everything in sight. And the Vajra family is by intellectualizing everything to death. The Vajra in the East. And in the middle, the Buddha family, the Buddha family, the way in which you avoid being present is just by zoning out. That's what Buddha people do. But I know well the karma exit. It's my exit. When I was working for Rinpoche, he used to call me, I'm not going to tell you.
Why not? Tell us. You have to now.
He used to call me the road runner. Road runner. His wife, he called the queen of the road runners. He said there's nothing inherently wrong with speed. The problem is that when it's neurotic, when you're using it to avoid being here, it's as though you have blinders on, like a road runner, and you just go very fast in one direction. And then you come to a screeching halt and change directions and go very fast in another direction. Because the speed is the way in which you are trying to alleviate your anxiety, the anxiety of ego.
That was extremely helpful. That just connected several dots for me. Is there, thank you. Is there something we can read or something that would shed light? I mean, that kind of humanized it for me. I don't know how to say it.
Irene Rockwell, her name is Irene, I-R-I-N-I, has written a whole book on the Buddha families a long time ago. There's a chapter in Cutting Through on the Buddha families, and the 5 of them. And this is the basic structure of the mandala, you see, that we all live in. We all have our own mandalas. And we're the center of our own mandalas. And each one of us has our own style, full of wisdom and neurosis and qualities. They're very big. It's really fun. It gets a little bit sort of, we used to sit around and try and figure out which Buddha families we all had.
Yeah.
Because there's your exit, but then there's the Buddha families that you really have. And what happens is the saner you get, the more you manifest those. You become really brilliant in expressing them. And everybody, of course, is unique in the way they express them, like snowflakes. This is the foundation of Tantra, understanding the mandala. Well, friends, I would love it if more people wanted to say more, but if not, we could end. Charles, you have any comments? No? Tim, that was good. Thank you. How about Nicole? Or Robin?
There was something I wanted to clarify, and I don't know how to ask it now. You said there was different names for, like the past time was resting space. Is it different stages of Buddhism or different stages until enlightenment? What were those things that you? I don't know if I'm asking the question right.
I'm not quite sure. I mean, there are different stages on the path.
Different what?
Different stages on the path.
Okay, and what are those stages?
Well,
I
path
think
is, see, what happened was that,
the turnings, I think she's talking about.
No, I'm not talking about the
Turnings.
she's not, she said no.
Yeah.
Maybe you're talking about the yanas. Jana is a word that means vehicle in Sanskrit. And there are different systems, but the one that Trungpa Rinpoche gave us is the Nyingma system that was used by the Kagyus to some extent. The two sects to which he belonged in Tibetan Buddhism. There are four main sects. And he liked to talk about the 9 jnanas, which are really the province of the Nyingma sect. And in the 9 jnanas, these are subdivided into 3 main divisions. The Hinayana, which means lesser vehicle. And it's made up of 2 sub-jnanas. The vehicle of the hearers, it's called the Shravaka-jnana, the hearers, and the vehicle of the self-enlightened Buddhas, the Pratyeka Buddhas in Sanskrit. And these are people, the self-enlightened Buddhas, who have realized part of egolessness, but not the whole thing. They've got a bit further to go. And where they have to go is, first of all, to enter into the Mahayana, which means the great vehicle. And the Mahayana is the path of the Bodhisattva, the person who has discovered emptiness, shunyata, the ultimate egolessness. And then as the person settles in to this world of emptiness, which is a different world, it's not a world of I and other anymore. This world, as they settle in 10 stages. This is so typical of Buddhism, always the numbers. And these 10 stages are called the bhumis in Sanskrit, B-H-U-M-I. Bhumis. And I won't go into the details on them, but they culminate, the 10 bhumis, in what's sometimes called the 11th bhumi, which is enlightenment itself. And this is the entrance into the Vajrayana as a state of mind. You've got to understand, state of understanding. You can do Vajrayana practices without being enlightened. But if you're progressing along the path in terms of your development, and you get to the 11th bhumi, or sometimes it's called the Vajra Adamantine Samadhi, state of awareness, absorption. And this is enlightenment itself. And from there, you progress into Tantra, into the Vajrayana, in which, in the Nyingma system, there are 6 more subdivisions, and that are what are called the lower Tantras, the lower vehicles, and the higher. I won't go into them in any detail. We have never studied any, I have never, but really the last 3 as techniques, the teachings of the last 3, and they have techniques for Vajrayana practice that you get in the last 3 vehicles. And the names for them are the Mahayoga, the Great Yoga, Jnana, vehicle, the Anu Yoga, Jana, which means the sort of the purification yoga, Jana, and finally, Ati, or in Tibetan, Subjin. And that means the great perfection. The great perfection are teachings that are really beautiful. And what my hope is for all of you, to get to the point where you've taken, this is my hope for any practitioner, where you've taken, here's the sequence. You take refuge, and you get a refuge name, by the way, that's kind of fun. Which you can use. I've got friends who use their refuge names. I don't, but other people do. And then beyond that, you have to take the Bodhisattva vows, and that's a subject in itself. It's quite beautiful. And then you get permission to start, if you've done enough Mahayana practice, enough meditation, pure just Vipassana, you get permission from a teacher to begin practicing what are called the preliminary practices. And this is the entrance into the Vajrayana. And there are 4 preliminary practices. They're called Nundro in Tibetan. And they're quite strenuous. Each one of them requires 100,000 repetitions. And the first one is really the lion at the gate. It's 100,000 prostrations, where you basically throw yourself on the floor, stand up again, and it's usually called 100,000 taking refuge, because while you're doing it, you go down, you're taking refuge you take refuge in the teacher, in the Buddha, in the Dharma, and in the Sangha. It's a 4-fold refuge. And you're doing a visualization. This is the essence of tantric practice. You're doing a visualization, you're reciting, and you're doing something with your body, physical body, all 3. The visualization is you're visualizing the refuge tree, which is on an island in the middle of a lake. And it's a tree that's full of, at the very top, in the Kagyu lineage, it would be the Buddha Vajradhara. And beneath that, the figures in the lineage, starting within the Kagyu lineage, Talopa, Naropa, Marpa, Milarepa, and then beyond that into the Karmapas, and all the way down, all the figures in the lineage. And in the center is your teacher as the Buddha. And around that figure, it's a complicated visualization. There are bodhisattvas and protectors and mahakalas, wrathful deities. And
Even the books, even the Dharma books are in there.
oh yeah, the books are in the background, the whole library.
Yeah.
And you do 100,000 prostrations, but it's really 108, because you go through the beads on a mala 1,000 times, and there are 108 beads on a mala. Now, for older people, there are accommodations that are made. So when you're young, you do those 100,000 prostrations, and it's quite strenuous physically. But when you're older, there are many accommodations that can be made. Or if a woman is pregnant and she can do tabletops, and for people who have physical limitations, they can do tabletops. That's the easiest version. And there are a bunch of steps in between. And then there are 3 other practices. Each one gets easier. They take quite a while, some of them. There's the 100,000 recitations of the 100-syllable mantra, which will become engraven on your eyeballs, as a friend of mine once said from the South. It's the 100-syllable mantra of Vajrasattva, purification. And then the 3rd practice is offering, the mandala offering, and you'll have a mandala plate, it's brass, and a basket full of rice, saffron rice with semi-precious stones in it, and you'll make mandalas again and again, and you're offering everything to the cosmos, your body, your speech, your mind, the whole world. And then in the 3rd, final step of the Nundro practice, and this is all preliminary practices, you are doing 100,000 Guru Yoga recitations. Each practice gets faster and easier than the one before, but they will require some time. And then you will enter the Vajrayana. And I want to tell you that there are teachers, like I've been studying with a man named Khenpo Namdrol. He's a wonderful teacher. He's very, very learned, to say the least. And at this point, he's teaching nothing but Dzogchen. And he would like everybody to have finished their Nundro. But if you finish Nundro, you can go right into Dzogchen with Khenpo Namdrol. And it's gorgeous. And even if you haven't finished Nundro, if you promise him that you're finishing it, you're doing it, and you're on the path, he will, depending on how he likes you, let you study with him, study Dzogchen. I've seen it happen. He's really an interesting piece of work, this man. He has a rule. Many of his teachings are multi-year, as many as 5 years on some of the texts that he's taught. He loves, above all, Longchenpa. Longchenpa was a great Buddhist teacher. Most Tibetans regard him as the greatest of all the Buddhist teachers. He lived in the 14th century, 1308 to 1369. I know, engraven on my eyeballs. And I once asked Trungpa Rinpoche if he could name the Babe Ruth of Tibetan Buddhism. Very sacrilegious thing to say. And he, without missing a beat, he said Longchenpa. So Khenpo Namdrol has a rule. If you're going to be in a multi-year program, you have to be there starting in the first year, and you can't miss a year. I know some great translators, Larry Mermelstein, Nalanda Translation Committee, B. Alan Wallace, who has translated everything you can think of. These are great scholars. And they tried to come to this teaching by Khenpo Namdrol in the second year, and he refused them. And then an old friend of mine, who is nothing special. I mean, she's like me, you know, she's not even a teacher. She doesn't teach. She's just a very strong practitioner. And she went and she asked if she could join in the second year. And he let her do it. And she was one of the early students of Trungpa Rinpoche. And after he died, I found out later, Dale had gone to Nepal and become a student of a man who died a few years ago. In his lifetime, was considered the greatest of all Dzogchen, great perfection masters. And she became his student. And she stayed there 18 years as his student. Contracted Lyme disease. She walks with crutches now. And Khenpo Namdrol said, "Oh yes, you can come." So it's really funny. But if you were doing your Nundro and you wanted to come to these teachings, I'd help you make the approach. You can study Dzogchen. But you have to get through refuge, Bodhisattva vows, and seem genuine. Yes.
John, do the Nyingma and the Kagyu schools have Lamrim?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Those are the graduated stages of the path.
Yes. And there are key Lamrim texts for the Lamrim means stages of the path, and generally what it means is pre-Vajrayana, although it often contains a lot of what's in the Vajrayana too, in sort of more beginning stages. Depends on the text. But some of the most famous Lamrim texts are Gampopa's Jewel Ornament of Liberation, which has been recently retranslated, and I think that's a blessing because the earlier translation was very difficult by Herbert Gunther. And there's one by Jigme Lingpa, I always forget the name of it, it's on my shelf here, and that's a Nyingma. The Gampopa one is Kagyu, Lamrim text. And then, if you really want to have some fun, there's the Nyingma text by Patrul Rinpoche, Words of My Perfect Teacher.
It's fun.
Huh?
It's fun. There are so many stories.
Some people hate it.
Oh, I love it.
It's what I call fire and brimstone Buddhism.
There are so many stories, fantastic stories.
It's terrific.
Yeah.
Patrul Rinpoche was such a character.
Yeah.
Such a character. He wandered the plains of Tibet as a beggar. And there's this story that he was going to go give teachings. He'd been invited to a monastery. And he's wandering across the plains towards this monastery. And he's just in rags. And he comes across a woman who's struggling with her children. Her husband has died. She's got these 2 children. She has a little bit of food. She's trying to feed them, trying to travel with them. And he offers to share his food with the mother and the children and to help carry the children. And they go to the monastery. And when they get to the gate, she doesn't know who he is. And he's this great teacher, Patrul Rinpoche. And she asks him if he would marry her. And he politely apologizes, says he can't, but he says, but come in with me into the monastery and I'll see if I can do something to help you, And she goes in with him and he disappears. The next day he's giving teaching and he's up on the teacher's throne, which they make it like a platform. And she is sitting at the back of the assembly of monks and nuns and some lay people. And she's mortified. She sees him up there and realizes who he is. And after the teaching is over, the monks and nuns bring the teacher's gift up to him. It's money. This is traditional. At the end of a teaching, you give teacher's gift. And he takes it and he walks down through the assembly and he hands it to her and walks out and wanders across the plains again. and get this, Patrul Rinpoche loved Nundro, the practice I just described to you. He did it more than 60 times. I've done it once. Paltry.
I never finished.
Yeah. If you wanted teachings from Khenpo Namdrol, you'd have to say you were going to finish. Go back to it. And if it's the prostrations that stopped you, I'll bet we could work out an easier version of them. You could do 3/4 prostrations, where you just bend down and touch the floor. Or you could even do tabletops if you've got an excuse.
It's hard to visualize. For some people it's easy. For some other people it's very hard. It's hard to visualize.
Rinpoche said he did them when he was 12 years old, and he and the guys that he was doing them with did them in about 2 weeks. 100,000 prostrations. That's
Impossible.
impossible. But young kids, they don't weigh anything. They got all that strength. They don't give a darn, bang, bang, bang.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, folks, we ought to end, unless anybody's got something else they want to say.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's do the dedication of merit. I'll put it on the screen. We're giving away all the benefit to help all sentient beings. This is what Bodhisattvas do. They realize that the only thing worth doing is helping others. It's the way to live. And so we aspire to that and chant the dedication of merit. Mute yourself if you would, just so we don't get cacophony. Whoops. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigden's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.